I have a love-hate relationship with epoxy, and in this video, my goal is to change that with a table that is unlike anything I've ever made before.
We're leaking.
We're gonna have a mess! So epoxy is becoming more and more popular these days as creators find new ways to implement it into their projects. I've been using epoxy in my project for like more than 5 years, and honestly, I was using it before it was the cool thing to do, so you could even say I'm an OG epoxy user if that's a thing. But that being said, I've never really made a project that is mainly epoxy based. I've only used it to kind of accent or just fill in parts of the wood. So anyone who's ever worked with epoxy knows it can be extremely messy, and it's not really the most enjoyable experience. So I decided to see if I can design a table that includes a lot of epoxy and find out if I actually enjoy the process. I'm starting with some 1/2-inch poplar that I have milled up and cut down into a circle for this project. And this is one of those projects where you really just have to trust the process because it's going to look ugly for quite some time, and you may think to yourself during this video, does this random kid on YouTube actually know what he's doing? And the short answer is no. And the long answer is actually still no, but I think these types of projects where they start out really questionable and as you're building them, you just have to trust your vision in your head. Those projects are usually the ones that end up turning out the best. So I have always had a weird kind of attraction to topographical maps that allow you to see the contours of elevation on a map. And that is actually a big inspiration for this project. Right now, I'm using a Sharpie to roughly lay out some topographical lines that I will turn in kind of to this frozen river valley as the table starts to take shape. Something that I've loved about design is finding something that is so random and obscure and being able to turn that into inspiration for a project. As someone who builds unique and cool tables on YouTube, I need to be able to think outside of the box, and the birth of this idea for this table was exactly that. So I'm someone who really enjoys snow, and I live in a part of Pennsylvania where we might get 1 to 2 decent snowstorms a year if we're lucky. But for the past 2 years, we've really gotten no snow at all. I use this weather app on my computer to see when our next snowstorm might swing by, and one metric I use is a map of the US that'll predict if the temperature will be like higher or lower in that area on average for the next 2 weeks. And it looks like this. Now, obviously, the blue sections representing it will be most likely colder than average, and the red is warmer than average. Anyways, what I'm getting at is that gradient of blues in the colder than average areas really caught my eye. Not only because when it was over Pennsylvania, it means there might be a higher chance of snow since it'll actually be cold enough, but just the aesthetic of that map when it was blue really looked pleasing. So I decided I wanted to add this into a table of mine. So as this project takes shape, I think you will really be able to see how I translated that map into the table. So right now I'm making the elevated sections of the table, or if you want to think of it as like the hills of the topographical map. I'm using some paint to transfer my rough design onto the wood panel, and while there probably had to be a better way to do this, this way actually worked good enough, and then I can use my bandsaw to cut out each section that I need for the table. So, like I said, this table is getting uglier before it will get prettier, and there is a method to my madness. All the lines that are drawn out are just rough layout lines so I can kind of understand where I need to make my cuts at. I imagine this is what not being able to like understand a language sounds like. To me, everything makes perfect sense in my head, and each line has its own purpose that I can understand. And to you, it probably looks like your kid brought home his 2nd grade art project, and you have to actually act like you like it. Anyways, I'm using my router with a 1/2-inch straight bit to carve out each layer, and there will be 6 layers in total. Now, I seem to find myself doing projects that a CNC machine could crank out in like 10 minutes pretty often. But instead, I'll take 4 hours to do the same thing, all for that handmade title. And sometimes I wonder if it's even worth it. But then I remember I'll beat the real woodworker allegations, and I don't have to worry about people leaving a comment that says I'm not a real woodworker, because I'm surely working the wood in this project, and I don't think anyone can argue with that. After I have the first layers carved out, I can clean up my mess with a broom and shop vac and get ready to do that all over again for the top 3 layers. Now, although it doesn't seem like I have done a ton yet, I would say I'm probably about 8 or 10 hours into this project, and there's been a lot of work just planning just to get to this point. I think this is the reason that some people are afraid to build that project that they aren't really sure if it'll turn out as well as they dreamed. I think makers' worst nightmare is to get like 10 hours into a project or maybe even further, and then they step back, they look at it, and they realize how much they hate how it looks so far. And I think that's a totally justified way to feel. If you look at a project as a failure, then honestly, that's exactly what it's going to be, a failure. But if you look at it as like a learning experience, it makes all the difference. Maybe you learned how to use a new tool or a technique, or you used a new material, or even learned that your design proportions are just not right. Just go back to the drawing board and analyze maybe where you went wrong. You will become so much better as a maker. But who am I to give life advice though, as some dude on YouTube? Okay, now that I have it sanded up a little bit, it at least doesn't look as hideous. It looks like something. So I guess I have to glue these things down. So it's gonna be my next step. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. So the reason I'm using poplar wood for this project is because after I glue each piece down, I'm going to be painting it. First off, poplar is cheap and readily available wood in my area, and it's great for painting because of its closed grain structure. Now we use some cauls and a bunch of F-clamps to hold down each piece, and this was kind of a tricky glue up because I wanted to make sure I got even clamping pressure along the whole way, like around the circle, around the board, because if I didn't, there would be gaps, and gaps just aren't fun. For the top layer, I use some regular wood glue as well as some CA glue just to speed up this process, since I could just use my body weight to hold pressure while the CA glue pretty quickly hardens. Looks pretty cool. So most people cringe when they see you paint over wood, but I think this time everyone will understand. Now, I wouldn't even consider myself an artist, even though some people might say my furniture is some sort of form of art, but I wanted to get out of my comfort zone and try something new. So I'm going to be hand painting each layer a gradient color, kind of like that blue weather map that I showed earlier. As I kind of hinted at earlier, I don't really have a clue what I'm doing with this paint. I could probably count the times I've painted on one of my hands outside of maybe like elementary school art class. But apparently there's even this thing called color theory, which I guess is kind of like music theory. And I have a theory that I don't know what any of that means. And the artists that may be watching are probably laughing at me right now, but I just bought up a bunch of acrylic paints and I'm mixing them together to try to create that gradient of blue colors from light to dark. It's probably just a good idea. Plus, I feel cool. I feel like someone who knows what they're doing, so I figured might as well put it on. Once I'm happy with the color of all the paint mixtures, I can go ahead and start painting. So remember when I said that this table starts out ugly and should turn into something, I guess, not as ugly? Well, this is that point in the process. I started with the lighter blue color and just worked my way across each layer. I tried to be as steady as possible, but I kind of knew I was going to have to come back later and touch up the paint anyways, so I wasn't too worried about any little mistakes at that moment. Now, I have to say, for this project in particular, this had to be one of the most enjoyable yet tedious processes. After each layer was done, I got excited to see what the next color of blue was going to look like. I enjoyed just kind of shutting my brain off and painting. I can definitely see how artists can spend hours in front of a canvas just working on a painting. Each layer probably took a good half an hour, if not maybe a bit more, and my hand definitely did start to hurt, but I found myself really focused on knocking this out. Once the first coat was dry, you could definitely tell it needed a second coat. So I went back with each color and repainted each layer, and once I had the second coat on, it made a huge difference, and I had a nice and uniform finish. So after that, I had to flip this over and go back with my flush trim bit around the perimeter of the table so I could build a mold around it for the epoxy pour. This pour I'm preparing for is going to be the most epoxy I've ever used in one go. So I was pretty nervous, and I really only had one shot at it, or all the work I've done up to this point would pretty much be ruined since there's no going back. In most of my projects, I usually use black epoxy, which is pretty much foolproof. The black covers up all the surfaces below, all the mess ups and mistakes, and you only really have to worry about what it will look like on the surface. Clear epoxy, on the other hand, is a whole different beast. You have to make sure the area around you is clean and no dirt will be able to get into the epoxy. Now, this deep pour epoxy takes at least 3 days to set, so I have to keep an eye on this table to make sure nothing falls into it too. After I build my mold around the outside, I'll put a little bead of silicone around to make sure none of the epoxy can leak out from the bottom. And after that, I hyped myself up enough and I was pretty much ready to go for this pour. So when I was thinking what I wanted to name this table, I was kind of stumped. I guess technically you could call it a river table, since it's kind of like a frozen river valley theme, if that's what you want to call it. But I personally am so over the river table movement. I think the tables are just tacky and at this point very unoriginal. When I use epoxy in my projects, my goal is to try and find a new and creative way to use it. And yes, I know I'm not the very first person to do a table in this kind of style, but I think it's still an original idea. So once you see the finished table, I definitely will need your help naming it without using any form of the word river or lake or any body of water. So let me know down in the comments and I'll pin my favorite or put it in the next video. All right, first bucket done. Probably need about 2 or 3 more of these things, but so far so good. No leaks yet, so we're gonna go and keep rolling. Little did I know in this moment I was about to be in for some fun. So deep pour epoxy is much more viscous than tabletop epoxy, meaning it will find cracks and leak much easier. And I know this just from watching other videos, and I was still like, I'll just throw some tape on there in that area where it's leaking, and that usually solves a problem for me. And I did that, and it did solve the problem for a little bit, so I just kept pouring until eventually it didn't. So this is like 3 hours later. We're leaking, as you can see. That ain't the only spot. Got a pretty good leak over here, but hopefully we're gonna get that fixed up. I think we got most of it. I guess we'll see in the morning. Hopefully. We're gonna have a mess. Well, some wise man once said, you can't win them all. And while this wasn't all lost, it surely wasn't a win. And to add insult to injury, a bug fell into the epoxy. But luckily, though, I was able to get it out before it hardened. So go ahead, lay into me, make fun of me, unsubscribe, comment idiot. Because I knew better not to make a mold like this, but I still proceeded to do it anyways. I can't be the only one that does something like that, right? That's crazy. Well, I guess hopefully. This is gonna be fun. No! My table! Yeah, see that? That's supposed to be like right there. And it's not there anymore, so kind of stinks, honestly. But it's fun trying to get these things off of here, I'm not gonna lie. There's another hole. Well, it needed replaced at some point, so. So after I ordered a new Formica sheet for the top of my workbench, I had to get this one cleaned up for the time being. Now I got this pretty cool utility knife that converts into like a scraper, so I use that to clean up most of the epoxy. This worked pretty well for the most part, other than the epoxy getting jammed in the mechanism for the knife, so now it's basically stuck in scraper mode. And I was pretty bummed out about this, but I found out during the project the phrase, "it is what it is," just kind of helped me get over a lot of things. After I let the table sit for about a full week to harden, I had plenty of time to think about my stakes, and I could go ahead and take off the barriers to get this thing flat. Now I decided to use my drum sander to do this because it was definitely going to be the easiest way for me. I sanded the top the whole way down to the top layer so that the epoxy would be perfectly level with the white layer once it was all said and done. After I sanded it, I honestly thought it looked pretty cool with just the raw wood, and for about 2 full seconds I actually considered leaving the wood unpainted, but then I decided against it because it just didn't feel right to me. So when I design furniture, as I'm working out all the details, I like to kind of think of the ideal room that this table could possibly live in. I think this is really important to do, especially if you want to sell your furniture at some point. If you want someone to buy it, they have to have a vision in their head that that piece of furniture will look amazing with the aesthetic of their house, especially if you want to command a high price. This table was kind of tough to do that with. Since its primary colors are white and blue, I figured it would be kind of hard to fit that into the average living room. Now this table, I would imagine, would fit in very few spaces, but the spaces that it could fit in, I feel like it would be beautiful and just be the center of attention, if that makes any sense. I imagine this table could go in a living room with maybe white walls and white couches with some lighter blue accents that overlooks a frozen ocean with a big picture window. Maybe like somewhere in Norway or somewhere cold. I generated a few images of that description, and here's what popped out. Now I don't use AI very often, but I might have to start because I was amazed with how accurate this is after only one prompt. But yes, I believe this table would be most ideal for a living room that looks exactly like this. Is this realistic for someone to have a living room like this? Probably not, but I think that's alright. Whoa! I'm so stupid. I don't know how I didn't realize that was going to happen. I feel so stupid. At this point in the build, I can get ready for an epoxy top coat. As you saw, I kind of forgot about a thing called water displacement and made it spill everywhere. But let's just pretend that never happened. The reason I'm putting this in hot water is because it's about 40 degrees outside, and this epoxy is very stiff and almost has the consistency of molasses. Now warming it in warm water allows it to become runnier, which then lets it self-level much easier. I tried as hard as I could to mix the epoxy slow and steady to prevent as many bubbles as entering the epoxy mix as possible, because bubbles are the enemy. I just used my hands to spread out all of the epoxy and made sure to cover the entire surface. After that, I came back with a torch to help pop any extra bubbles and help that epoxy self-level a little bit better. After 24 hours, the epoxy was cured, and I came back with my sander with some 80 grit sandpaper and just sanded all the high spots off. And then after that, I decided I wanted to go ahead and add another layer on top just to add up a nice thick layer of protection. The first layer didn't really level as well as I would have liked it to, but the second layer did a much better job at being flat and smooth. Although it was better, it still wasn't perfect. Now, if I don't get this top perfectly flat, when I go to buff out the epoxy, there will still be leftover waves and it will create this horrible wavy looking finish. I attached these 2 pieces of sandpaper to a maple block and started hand sanding out all the high spots. This was actually pretty great for me because I probably didn't go to the gym that morning. So instead I can get my workout in by sanding this top flat for like an hour or 2. The sandpaper actually kept getting gunked up a little bit, but nothing a little compressed air couldn't fix. Once I was done, I had to address something I kept avoiding up until this point. So when you do an epoxy top coat, these drips form around the outside edge. I was hoping I would be able to just chisel them off without damaging the paint on the underside, but sadly that was not the case. I didn't really get the best shot, but you can see how it removes some of the paint, and I really couldn't stand it. So once I chiseled off all the drips, which is actually pretty satisfying, I had to sand the entire paint job off, all of the bottom, and refinish it. This really wasn't a huge deal, it just took me some extra time. After I got the bottom of the table repainted, I could start the process of buffing the top to a high gloss. Even though this is a monotonous process, I was actually really excited to do this. This was my first time trying to create a high gloss finish, so not only did I not know what I was doing, but I spent over like $400 on the tools to even help me do it. And that's why I love creating. Yeah, definitely not the spending money part, but more the creating part. I try to look at every skill as a tool, just like a planer or a table saw. Every new skill that I can learn is like adding a new tool to my arsenal to become a better craftsman. Once I learn how to do a process once, then I'll have that skill hopefully forever. While it can be scary to try something new, it's definitely how we grow and be better craftsmen. And the best way to learn is through trial and error. Little did I know that I've already made my first error up to this point in the buffing process, but I just kept buffing away with each step of the process. I did learn pretty quickly though that buffing creates a huge mess because it just flings all the extra compound over everything in like a 5-foot radius, including your clothes. But hey, trial and error, right? Alright, so I just got done sanding and polishing this thing, and it just doesn't look good. There's like scratch marks all over the top. I mean, this was my first time doing like a high polish like this, so I didn't really know what I was doing, but it looks good from a distance, but once you get up real close, you can see the swirl mark. So obviously I just didn't sand good enough, so I'm going to resand this, probably starting from 120 grit and going all the way up again. So now I get to spend the next 2 or 3 hours resanding this. I'm so excited. I'm so excited. Yes! Can't wait! I was pretty hesitant to start sanding again and ruin all that work I put in up until this point, but I knew it was the right thing to do. This time around, I probably sanded for 2 times as long as I did the last time to make sure there were no leftover scratches at all. I cleaned the surface with each grip with some isopropyl alcohol to prevent any leftover dust from scratching the surface on the next grit as well. I did some research on the buffing process and found out that you kind of have to dig the buffer into the top. I also only did 2 passes with each compound on the first round, when in reality I found out that you should probably do more like 5 to really cut away some material and get rid of any scratch marks left with the sandpaper. I also wore an apron this time to avoid getting any compound all over my clothes. And look at me. I was learning 3 new things after only 1 failure, and after that round, the top looked so much better and I was really happy with how it came out. For the sides, I just used this small pad and buffed it in by hand. This definitely did take a little while, but it was pretty hard to get with the buffer I was using, and this actually worked better than I expected. So I don't know about you, but I've never seen a tabletop without a base on it, so that's going to be the next thing I'm going to work on. Since there's a lot going on in the top, I'm going to keep the base much simpler. I played around with the design a little bit as I usually do and came up with this. I figured I'll keep a white base to match the top and make that blue in the top really stand out. Instead of using Popler though, which has that closed grain, I'm using red oak, which has a more open grain structure, which will allow the grain to be seen through the white paint. So I'm a maker who likes to custom make almost all of my table bases. I feel like each top just needs a unique base to perfectly complement it. I see some of those tables out there that have just incredibly beautiful tops, and then they just buy like a prefab metal base and just throw it on there. And I'm like, oh man, it just feels like they kind of gave up on the whole table. Now trust me, there are absolutely beautiful tables with stunning matching metal bases, so stop typing your hate comment. Just delete it. Just delete it right now. All that being said though, I feel like this is one of those projects where I could just throw a nice matching white metal base on there and the table would still feel fully complete. But I like to make my life hard, and honestly, it's just more cost efficient for me to build my own base. One of these days though, I will buy a base and make my life easy, I promise, but that day is just not today. For this base, I'm doing a half lap joint, which will allow the 2 pieces to kind of slide together. Now this is a touchy joint because if you make it too tight, obviously the joint will not fit together. And if you make it too big, you will see ugly gaps along the joint line. So I had to be really careful here and kind of finesse the joint. Yeah, it's definitely a little too tight. So. Yeah, that was definitely harder than it should have been to get those pieces apart, but my solution to make those joints just a little bit looser is to clamp them together and just take some 60 grit sandpaper and sand down the insides of each joint. This will allow me to test fit without removing too much material, so I can kind of sneak up on the perfect fit. The last thing to do is to add these large roundovers to soften up the base a little bit. Since I was using a big bit, I slowed down my router a little bit and decided to take multiple passes to prevent tear out and to just be safer. Because being safe is just cool, guys. To finish the base here, I'm doing a process that I've never done before. Imagine that. It seems like that's a kind of a common theme here, but I'm using this white paint and primer mixture that is about 25% watered down, and I'm using that kind of as a base layer for the legs. I sprayed 2 really thin coats to fully cover each section, and the reason that I added a bit of water to the paint is because I didn't want to fill the oak grain with the paint. After that, I will apply this whitewash product that's kind of a stain, but it's marketed as a wood enhancer, whatever that even means. But this will dye the grain that didn't get painted. I just brushed each side on with a foam brush, let it soak in for a little bit, and then wiped it off after about 2 or 3 minutes. After it's dry, you can really see the difference in appearance, and that was exactly the look I was trying to achieve. Now, it might seem like I'm some finishing wizard with all the complicated steps that I just took to achieve that look, but in reality, I just messed around with a few scrap pieces until I achieved the look I was going for. At this point, we're pretty much coming down to the home stretch. I was beating the base in with my rubber mallet, and the thing actually flew apart, but I still ended up making it work. I just used the head and pounded the rest of it in, but if you're looking to support me in making these videos, the best way to do that is just to subscribe and maybe share this video with a friend who you think would maybe enjoy it. That'd be very epic of you to do that. Once you see the final product of this table, I really want you to let me know what you think. I asked this question on my last video and I really enjoyed everyone's feedback. I think it's kind of funny because there were a lot of people who didn't like the table and they felt the need to put a disclaimer in saying, well, you asked for it. And I'm like, yeah, I know I did. That's the point. I think the quicker you realize that everyone will have their own opinions and that you shouldn't take negative feedback personally, the easier life gets. So with your utmost honesty, tell me what you think. Anyways, the last thing I need to do is attach the base to the top. And I'm using these real low profile threaded inserts because the last thing I want to do is drill through the wood into the epoxy and you'll be able to see it from the top. I attached some aluminum plates to the base that will allow me to screw the base into place onto the top. Once it's in place, the table is pretty much ready to go. Now, I learned a ton in building this table, and it took me way longer than I expected. But hey, that's how it always goes. Everyone knows that. It's definitely not perfect, and there are some small minor imperfections. But overall, it turned out exactly as I was envisioning, and I'm so happy with the final result. I swear it's literally never going to snow.